Picture this: 1% of the world's population controls more than half of its wealth. Yes, you heard it right, a mere 1%. It seems almost unimaginable, doesn't it? Yet this is the unsettling reality we live in. The scales of global wealth are tipped so far in one direction that they seem impossible to balance. This is not a random occurrence, but the result of a system, a global economic order, that has been in place for decades. This order, established and maintained by powerful nations and multinational corporations, has shaped our world in ways that are both visible and hidden. The stark disparity in wealth is one of its most glaring outcomes. The rich amass wealth at an unprecedented rate, while the rest of the population struggles to make ends meet. But how did we get here? To understand this, we need to take a step back to the 1970s. The 1970s marked a pivotal shift in the international economic order. This was a decade that saw the world economy convulse and transform, driven by a series of events that would forever alter the global economic landscape. First came the oil crisis of the early 70s, a sudden quadrupling of oil prices by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, sent shockwaves through the world. Economies heavily reliant on oil, particularly those in the West, were thrown into turmoil. The crisis triggered a profound realization. Our economies were deeply intertwined, vulnerable to the actions of a handful of oil-rich nations. Meanwhile, another seismic shift was underway: the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Established in the aftermath of World War II, this system had tied currencies to the value of gold, with the US dollar as the global reserve currency. But by the early 70s, the system was under pressure. Inflation, economic instability, and a growing US deficit led to its inevitable fall. The world moved towards a system of floating exchange rates, where currencies' values were determined by market forces. And then, there was the rise of neoliberalism. Championed by economists like Milton Friedman, neoliberalism extolled the virtues of free markets, deregulation, and privatization. Governments, particularly in the US and the UK, embraced these ideas, leading to a wave of economic liberalization that swept across the globe. Each of these events, the oil crisis, the collapse of Bretton Woods, the rise of neoliberalism, were like tectonic shifts reshaping the economic terrain. They led to a more market-oriented global economy characterized by free trade, flexible exchange rates, and a greater role for the private sector. As the 70s ended, the world was primed for a new economic era, one that would shape the next decades. This decade of transformation set the stage for the economic events and policies that would follow, from the age of globalization to the economic trials of the 21st century. The world was getting smaller, or so it seemed, as the 80s ushered in the age of globalization. Picture a tapestry of economies, once disparate and disjointed, now weaving together into a single, intricate design. This is the era we're diving into now. Technological advances were the loom on which this tapestry was woven. The advent of the internet, rapid developments in telecommunications, and the rise of personal computing made cross-border communication and business operations faster and more efficient than ever. The world was not only figuratively, but literally at our fingertips. Now, let's talk about free trade agreements. These were the threads that bound economies together. From the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, to the formation of the European Union, these agreements broke down barriers and opened up markets. Goods, services, and capital flowed across borders like water, creating a global market that was bigger and more dynamic than ever before. But what is a market without its players? Enter multinational corporations, the weavers of our economic tapestry. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Toyota didn't just sell to the world, they operated on a global scale. They sourced materials from one country, manufactured in another, and sold in many more. Their growth was exponential, and so was their impact on the global economy. This fusion of technology, free trade, and multinational corporations accelerated globalization at a breakneck pace. Wealth began to accumulate at the top, creating a new class of ultra-rich individuals and corporations. The world economy was booming, but the distribution of wealth was increasingly skewed. But it's important to note, this age of globalization wasn't a utopia. While multinational corporations thrived and wealth accumulated, not everyone shared in the prosperity. Many regions and industries struggled to adapt to this new global order. Jobs were lost, communities were left behind, and economic inequality widened. The world was interconnected like never before, but not everyone was reaping the benefits. Just as the world was getting used to unprecedented growth, the rug was pulled from under our feet with the Great Recession. It was a jarring reminder that prosperity, no matter how seemingly robust, could be ephemeral. In the early 2000s, the global economy was riding high on a wave of optimism. Markets were booming, and wealth was being generated at a dizzying pace. But beneath the sheen of prosperity lurked structural flaws that would soon expose themselves in the most brutal of ways. In 2008, the world was rocked by a financial crisis of a scale not seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Banks collapsed, economies teetered on the brink of bankruptcy, and millions of people lost their jobs. It was a seismic shock that reverberated across the globe, shaking the very foundations of the international economic order. The crisis exposed the vulnerabilities of the global economic system, its over-reliance on debt, and the dangerous interconnectivity of financial institutions. It laid bare the lack of effective regulation, the reckless risk-taking, and the systemic greed that had fueled the boom years. The world watched in horror as the dominoes fell, one by one, toppling economies and shattering lives. In the aftermath, there was a push for more regulation, for greater oversight, for checks and balances to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. Governments and international bodies scrambled to put in place measures to rein in the excesses of the financial sector. The era of unfettered capitalism, it seemed, was over. But as the dust settled, a new economic order was emerging. The crisis had accelerated the shift towards a multipolar world, a world no longer dominated by a single economic powerhouse, but rather a constellation of emerging economies. Countries like China, India, and Brazil became increasingly influential, their economies growing at a pace that outstripped their developed counterparts. They became key players in the global economy, their voices carrying weight in the corridors of economic power. The world was changing, and the rules of the game were being rewritten. The Great Recession was a turning point, a moment of reckoning that forced us to confront the shortcomings of our economic systems. It was a harsh lesson in the dangers of complacency, the perils of unchecked growth, and the importance of sustainable, inclusive development. But it was also a catalyst for change, sparking a wave of innovation, of resilience, of adaptability. It ushered in a new era of economic thinking, one that recognized the need for greater equity, for economic justice, and for a more balanced approach to growth. As we moved into the 2020s, the world was grappling with new economic realities. The Great Recession had left deep scars, but it had also opened up new possibilities, new pathways towards a fairer, more sustainable future. And as we navigated this unfamiliar landscape, we were reminded of the enduring truth that in every crisis lies the seed of opportunity. Then came 2020, a year that will be etched in history for the global upheaval it caused. The COVID-19 pandemic was not just a health crisis, but a severe economic shock, sending ripples through every corner of the globe. Economies were brought to a standstill as lockdowns were enforced, businesses shuttered, and travel halted. The pandemic, however, didn't affect everyone equally. It exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities. Those already on the edge were pushed further into the abyss, while the wealthy saw their fortunes swell. This stark disparity ignited a global conversation on the need for a more equitable economic system. The pandemic also disrupted the global supply chain, leading to a rethinking of the international economic order. Dependency on single-source suppliers was identified as a vulnerability, prompting countries to diversify their supply chains. This shift, in turn, has led to a reconfiguration of economic power. In the wake of the pandemic, there has been a surge in digital transformation. The digital economy, driven by technology and innovation, has become a critical pillar of economic growth, reshaping industries and job markets. The pandemic has also underscored the need for greater international cooperation. As nations grapple with the twin challenges of economic recovery and building resilience against future shocks, collaboration, not competition, is the order of the day. As we stand in 2024, the international economic order is in flux, and only time will tell where we head next. From the shocks of the 70s to the uncertainties of the 2020s, the international economic order has been a roller coaster ride. We've traced the transformation from the birth of a new order in the 70s through the globalization era, the Great Recession, and the recent pandemic. Each phase has shaped wealth distribution, reflecting the dynamic nature of our global economic landscape. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the international economic order. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe to Express Econ Geofinance Insights for more insightful content.